While you're debating whether your morning coffee counts as addiction, Roman emperors were making world-changing decisions while high on 60-ingredient drug cocktails that would hospitalize a modern cartel boss. And the most mind-shattering example, Marcus Aurelius, yes, the philosopher whose quotes dominate your Instagram feed, was a functioning opiate addict whose legendary meditations were literally written by someone so chemically dependent his doctor had to adjust his daily drug doses when they interfered with military planning. Every inspirational quote you've ever shared about self-control and rational thinking came from an addict's diary. And that's just the beginning of how badly you've been lied to about history. Picture this scene that will destroy everything you thought you knew. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, whose wisdom guides millions of modern self-help seekers, sitting in his military tent at 3 a.m. The air reeks of burning opium. By flickering lamplight, he's carefully measuring out his daily fix, a substance cocktail called theriac, containing over 60 psychoactive ingredients that would be Schedule 1 controlled substances today. His hands shake slightly as he adds the cannabis extract. Tomorrow, he'll lead battles that shape civilization. Tonight, he's just another addict managing his dependency. His physician Galen, the most respected doctor in the ancient world, wasn't treating Marcus Aurelius for wisdom or philosophical insight. He was running a medically supervised drug program for the most powerful man on earth. When the emperor complained that his daily cocktail was making him too drowsy to plan military campaigns, Galen didn't suggest sobriety. He adjusted the dosage like any dealer managing a high-functioning client. This is the man whose philosophical writings about rational thinking and self-discipline still inspire millions. The ultimate irony? Marcus Aurelius literally couldn't function without chemicals that modern neuroscientists say would cause severe cognitive impairment and physical dependency within weeks. But Marcus Aurelius looks like a health nut compared to what other emperors were mainlining. Picture Emperor Nero in his golden house, servants approaching with his evening ritual, not wine, but nepenthe, the opium-based potion Homer wrote could make people forget all sorrows. As the drug floods his system, his pupils dilate to black pools while around him, terrified dinner guests wait to see what tonight's chemically enhanced entertainment will involve. This isn't palace luxury, it's the nerve center of the known world being operated by someone who can barely distinguish hallucination from reality. Here's something that will make your blood freeze. Emperor Claudius wasn't murdered with poison. He was already consuming psychoactive mushrooms daily as part of his normal routine. His wife Agrippina didn't introduce anything foreign to his system, she simply switched his regular mind-altering fungi for deadly ones. The man who conquered Britain and engineered aqueducts that still function today was making those legendary decisions while essentially microdosing hallucinogens every morning with breakfast. The assassination wasn't even creative, it was just changing one drug for another in a system where imperial decision-making was already completely chemically compromised. But the absolute peak of imperial insanity was Emperor Commodus, who genuinely believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules. Modern historians think this wasn't megalomania. It was drug-induced psychosis from something Romans called divine wine, a hallucinogenic cocktail so powerful that users reported direct conversations with mythological figures. Commodus would chug this liquid insanity before entering gladiatorial arenas fighting lions while convinced he was a literal god. The emperor of Rome was governing an empire while suffering from chemically induced delusions, and nobody could intervene because questioning the emperor's mental state was treason. Think about that horror. The most powerful civilization in human history was being run by leaders who were essentially psychiatric patients, but instead of treatment, they had unlimited access to every mind-altering substance in the known world. Here's a detail that will haunt your nightmares. Roman emperors employed official poison tasters whose real job wasn't checking for assassination attempts. They were human drug-testing laboratories. These servants would consume the emperor's psychoactive cocktails first to gauge potency and side effects before the ruler would risk his daily dose. Imagine being so paranoid about your drug quality that you need multiple people to potentially overdose before you'll take your morning fix. These weren't just employees, they were living chemistry experiments who regularly died testing Imperial drug combinations. The most powerful men in the ancient world were so chemically dependent that they'd literally kill servants rather than risk taking untested substances. But if the people running the empire were this chemically insane, imagine what they gave their soldiers before sending them to conquer the world. Picture a Roman centurion before the Battle of Alesia in 52 BC, moving through his ranks not with weapons inspections but with small leather pouches containing what would today land him in federal prison for drug trafficking. Inside each pouch, carefully measured doses of what Romans called medicine, but what we now recognize as military-grade performance enhancers that make modern PEDs look like children's vitamins. Opium for the siege engineers who'd endure months of brutal warfare without breaking, stimulant-heavy plant cocktails for cavalry who needed superhuman endurance during 12-hour battles, and for the elite shock troops storming enemy walls, silphium, a mysterious plant so powerful it made soldiers genuinely believe they were invincible gods of war. Here's what will blow your mind. Roman legions didn't just carry swords and shields, they carried personalized drug kits distributed by specialized military officers called capsari. But these weren't medics in any modern sense. They were essentially military drug dealers with imperial backing, trained to distribute specific psychoactive cocktails based on combat roles and battle conditions. If you think modern military enhancement programs are controversial, Romans had industrialized chemical warfare on their own troops 2,000 years ago with a sophistication that would make DARPA jealous. The crown jewel of Roman military pharmacology was silphium, a plant so valuable it was literally worth more than gold by weight. Soldiers would chew silphium roots before major battles until their hearts raced, pupils dilated, and they genuinely felt like they could tear through enemy lines with bare hands. Julius Caesar's campaigns weren't just about territorial expansion, they were partly motivated by securing access to North African silphium fields that kept his legions chemically enhanced. Here's the most insane part. Romans were so dependent on this combat drug that they harvested silphium into complete extinction by the 1st century AD. Think about that horror. The Roman Empire literally consumed their secret military weapon out of existence because they couldn't fight wars without it. But the psychological warfare gets even more twisted. Roman commanders didn't just drug their own soldiers, they deliberately contaminated enemy territories with disorienting substances before battles. They'd poison water supplies with plants that caused confusion, paranoia, and hallucinations, then attack while their enemies were chemically impaired and stumbling around battlefields like zombies. Caesar's famous accounts of conquering Gaul describe Celtic warriors acting erratically and without their usual courage before major battles. What he conveniently omits is that Roman infiltrators had been slipping hallucinogenic herbs into Celtic food supplies for weeks before these confrontations. The legendary Roman military genius wasn't superior tactics, it was systematic chemical warfare against enemies who had no idea they were being drugged. The veteran crisis reveals the true horror of this system. When Roman soldiers returned from decades-long campaigns, they weren't just dealing with what we'd now call PTSD. They were managing severe chemical withdrawal from substances they'd been consuming since enlistment. Roman military hospitals weren't just treating battle wounds, they were running mass addiction treatment programs for troops who literally couldn't function in civilian life without their combat drugs. These men would return home unable to work normal jobs, maintain relationships, or sleep through the night without the chemical enhancement cocktails that had kept them functional for years. Families would watch their warrior heroes transform into shaking, paranoid wrecks who'd committed horrific acts while chemically enhanced, but now couldn't even handle basic social interactions while sober. Here's something that will make your skin crawl. Roman military expansion wasn't just about conquest, it was about securing drug supply lines across the known world. Their invasion of Egypt wasn't just for grain, they wanted control of opium production centers. Their brutal campaigns in Britain were motivated partly by Celtic knowledge of psychoactive plants that could enhance combat performance. Those legendary Roman roads everyone celebrates. They were essentially drug highways, moving psychoactive substances across the empire faster than any civilization had ever managed. Modern comparison time. If you think cartels are sophisticated, Romans had imperial government backing for their drug operations. They had state-sponsored research into combat enhancement, official military positions dedicated to drug distribution, and entire provinces conquered specifically to secure access to psychoactive resources. Pablo Escobar wishes he had Roman logistical capabilities and government protection, but the absolute maximum horror was what happened after battles were won. Roman victory celebrations weren't just parties, they were drug-fueled sexual exploitation events, where soldiers, already high on combat stimulants, were given additional aphrodisiacs and disinhibiting substances for entertainment with conquered populations. This wasn't random soldier behavior, it was organized policy. Romans had developed systematic protocols for using drugs to facilitate sexual exploitation during conquests, breaking the psychological resistance of conquered peoples while rewarding troops with chemically enhanced experiences they couldn't achieve in civilian life. Roman soldiers were basically super soldiers on military-grade narcotics, conquering territories while high and celebrating victories with state-sponsored chemical coercion. But that's nothing compared to what regular Romans were chugging at every meal. Picture a wealthy Roman dinner party in 50 AD and forget everything you think you know about ancient hospitality. Guests aren't offered water or simple wine, they're handed goblets of conditum paradoxum, a cocktail so toxic it would send every emergency room in America into crisis mode within minutes. The amber liquid sparkles in torchlight, sweet with honey and fragrant with exotic spices. What the guests don't realize as they raise these goblets to their lips is that they're about to consume a psychoactive nightmare containing over 50 mind-altering ingredients that are illegal in every country on Earth today. Here's what they don't teach in history class, and it will shatter your brain. Roman wine wasn't wine at all. It was liquid insanity, routinely spiked with substances that make fentanyl look like aspirin. We're talking about dinner cocktails containing opium poppy extracts, cannabis seeds, henbane that causes violent hallucinations, and something Romans called Greek hay, which modern scientists believe was actually fenugreek laced with ergot, the same fungus that produces LSD. Wealthy Romans weren't just getting drunk at dinner parties, they were accidentally tripping on psychedelics while discussing politics, arranging marriages and making business deals that affected millions of lives across the empire. But here's where it gets absolutely horrifying. Romans didn't just add drugs to their wine, they sweetened it with lead. Not by accident, but intentionally. Winemakers would boil wine in lead-lined pots to create sapa, a syrup so toxic that modern toxicologists can't believe anyone survived drinking it regularly. The lead didn't just poison them slowly, it enhanced the psychoactive effects of other drugs, creating a compound high that explains the legendary erratic behavior of Roman aristocrats. Think about this nightmare. Every single dinner party was essentially a game of chemical Russian roulette, where guests had no idea what combination of brain-melting substances they were consuming or how those substances would interact in their systems. If you think Vegas bachelor parties are wild, Romans had symposiums that were essentially organized drug orgies disguised as intellectual discussion. These weren't refined cultural gatherings. They were chemical disasters where participants consumed specific wine blends designed to progress guests through stages, from euphoria to hallucinations to complete loss of inhibition to memory blackouts. They had different wines for different effects, like a psychoactive menu from hell. Some blends were designed to induce religious visions. Others contained sexual enhancement herbs mixed with disinhibiting substances. Special divine communion mixtures allegedly allowed direct communication with gods, which was actually just participants hallucinating while completely out of their minds on plant-based DMT compounds. Here's a detail that will make you never look at dinner parties the same way. Roman hosts would deliberately serve stronger drug cocktails to guests they wanted to manipulate, sexually exploit, or extract information from. Dinner invitations weren't social courtesy. They were potential chemical assault scenarios where powerful Romans could drug anyone they invited into their homes. The most shocking discovery came from Pompeii, where volcanic ash preserved the horrifying truth. Archaeologists found wine amphorae with residue analysis revealing cannabis, opium, and sexual enhancement herbs mixed together in the same containers. These weren't medicinal preparations stored in some back room. They were the standard dinner beverages served to guests in wealthy homes. The preserved villas show specialized rooms with drug preparation equipment, suggesting Roman aristocrats weren't just consuming these substances. They were manufacturing personalized psychoactive cocktails in their own kitchens, like ancient meth labs disguised as wine cellars. Take the legendary drinking habits of Mark Antony, whose political downfall wasn't just about poor military decisions. It was about making those decisions while consuming wine mixtures that contained opium, cannabis, and sexual enhancement herbs. Historical accounts describe him negotiating with foreign ambassadors, planning military campaigns, and conducting state business while under the influence of cocktails that would render modern politicians completely incapacitated. The man who nearly conquered Rome alongside Cleopatra was essentially a high-functioning drug addict whose chemical dependency influenced the fate of empires and shaped the political future of the Mediterranean world. But here's the maximum horror that will keep you awake tonight. Roman medical texts describe something called theriac, the same complex antidote we mentioned with Marcus Aurelius. But it wasn't just for emperors. Wealthy Romans were consuming daily doses of this 60-ingredient psychoactive mixture as a routine health supplement, the way modern people take multivitamins. Except instead of vitamins, they were taking daily doses of opium, cannabis, and various hallucinogenic plants while conducting normal business, raising children, and making decisions that affected entire communities. Roman civilization was essentially running on a society-wide microdosing program that lasted for centuries. The Roman physician Pliny the Elder documented the results in graphic detail. Pallid complexions, drooping eyelids, tremulous hands, and dreams of monstrous lustfulness. He warned that excessive consumption drove people to 1,000 crimes. But even as doctors were writing these warnings, Roman society kept mixing stronger and more toxic combinations because they weren't just addicted to alcohol. They were addicted to the entire psychoactive experience that had become their normal social reality. If Romans were accidentally tripping at dinner parties while making empire-changing decisions, you won't believe how they convinced themselves this chemical chaos was actually religious worship. If your brain isn't completely fried by this point, smash that subscribe button because it gets so much worse. What we're about to discover about Roman religion will make their dinner party drug cocktails look like communion wine, because Romans didn't just get high for fun, they convinced themselves it was worship. Picture this scene that will destroy your faith in ancient spirituality. Scythian mourners in 400 BC crawling on hands and knees under massive felt tents while hemp seeds burn on red-hot stones, filling the enclosed space with cannabis vapor so thick you can barely breathe. According to Herodotus, the participants begin howling with joy as psychoactive smoke overwhelms their nervous systems and sends them into chemically induced religious ecstasy. This isn't a funeral, it's a mass drug experience disguised as spiritual ceremony. And Romans didn't just witness these rituals when they encountered foreign tribes. They imported them, industrialized them, and turned them into the backbone of imperial religion. Here's what will absolutely annihilate everything you thought you knew about Roman temples. Those magnificent religious buildings weren't houses of worship, they were ancient pharmacies, run by priests who were essentially drug dealers with divine authority and government protection. The Temple of Bacchus in Pompeii, perfectly preserved by volcanic ash, reveals the shocking truth that archaeologists tried to hide for decades. They found not just wine storage areas, but elaborate drug manufacturing facilities with grinding stones for processing cannabis, distillation equipment for concentrating opium, and residue from psilocybin mushrooms coating preparation surfaces. Roman priests weren't spiritual leaders guiding people toward enlightenment. They were ancient pharmacologists who knew exactly which psychoactive combinations would produce which types of religious experiences, and they were distributing these substances to thousands of people during every major festival. If you think Burning Man represents drug-fueled spirituality, Romans had Bacchanalia festivals that made modern raves look like church prayer circles. These weren't religious gatherings, they were state-sponsored drug orgies where participants consumed cocktails containing plants with natural DMT, psilocybin mushrooms, and opium-based mixtures specifically designed to induce different categories of divine visions. The famous Senate crackdown on Bacchanalia in 186 BC wasn't about moral outrage over sexual impropriety. It was about politicians realizing that mass drug ceremonies were destabilizing Roman society because participants were literally too chemically altered to function in normal jobs, maintain families, or pay taxes for months after these festivals ended. But here's where it gets truly insane. Romans developed a sophisticated religious drug menu where different psychoactive substances were used to communicate with specific gods. Want to consult the underworld deities about deceased relatives? Priests would distribute opium-heavy mixtures that induced death-like states where participants believed they were visiting the realm of the dead. Planning to seek guidance from Mars about military campaigns? Stimulant-based cocktails made participants feel invincible and aggressive, interpreting these chemically induced feelings as divine approval for warfare. Seeking wisdom from Minerva about intellectual pursuits? Hallucinogenic plants caused complex visual and auditory experiences that participants interpreted as direct divine communication. This wasn't random drug use, it was systematic chemical manipulation of religious experience on an industrial scale. The Oracle at Delphi reveals the ultimate religious drug conspiracy that will make you question every spiritual experience in human history. For centuries, people believed the Pythia's prophecies came from genuine divine inspiration, but modern geological surveys discovered something that changes everything. The temple was built directly over a natural fault line that released ethylene gas, a substance that causes euphoria, hallucinations, and dissociative experiences. But Romans didn't just rely on accidental gas leaks, they enhanced the natural psychoactive effects with additional plant-based drugs, turning prophetic sessions into elaborate chemical ceremonies where major political and military decisions affecting millions of lives were made based on the hallucinations of someone who was essentially huffing industrial solvents mixed with hallucinogenic plants. Here's something that will make your skin crawl. Roman fertility ceremonies weren't about agricultural blessings. They were drug-enhanced sexual exploitation rituals disguised as religious practice. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii's temple brothels shows preparation areas for cannabis, plants containing natural DMT, and psilocybin mushrooms specifically used during sacred prostitution ceremonies. Participants would consume these substances believing they were achieving divine union with the goddess, but in reality, they were being systematically drugged for sexual exploitation, while too chemically impaired to consent or even remember what happened to them. The mysteries of Dionysus represent the peak of religious drug horror that defies comprehension. These ceremonies weren't mysterious because they were secret. They were mysterious because participants were so chemically altered they couldn't remember what had been done to them or what they had done to others. Initiates would consume substance combinations that modern neuroscientists believe included natural MAOIs mixed with DMT containing plants, creating experiences so intense that participants genuinely believed they had died, traveled to other dimensions, and been reborn as completely different people. The ceremonies involved not just hallucinations but complete personality dissociation that could last for weeks. But here's the maximum horror that will haunt your nightmares forever. Roman mystery religions specifically targeted vulnerable populations: slaves, women, foreigners, and the economically desperate, with drug-based initiation ceremonies designed to create psychological dependency and financial exploitation. These weren't spiritual experiences leading to enlightenment. They were systematic chemical indoctrination programs. Initiates would become so psychologically dependent on the drug-induced divine experiences that they'd sacrifice everything, their money, sexual autonomy, family relationships and social connections, just to participate again. Modern comparison time. If you think modern cults are manipulative, Romans invented religious drug dependency 2,000 years ago on a scale that would make Scientology jealous. They had government-sponsored temples distributing psychoactive substances, official religious positions dedicated to drug administration, and entire festival calendars designed around mass chemical experiences that left participants financially ruined and psychologically controlled. For 500 years, Rome ran on this system perfectly, a drug empire where every aspect of life was chemically enhanced and religiously justified. Then came the day the drugs ran out, and what happened next was history's first recorded case of civilization-wide withdrawal symptoms that destroyed the greatest empire ever created. Picture the scene in 410 AD that ended the greatest civilization in human history. Barbarian tribes are severing Roman supply lines across Gaul and Germania, but inside the Imperial palace, the real crisis isn't military defeat, it's pharmaceutical catastrophe. Servants frantically search storage rooms for the emperor's daily theriac ingredients, finding only empty amphorae where Egyptian opium was once stockpiled. The Scythian cannabis trade routes are cut off. Silphium has been extinct for centuries. Spanish lead mines are controlled by Visigoth armies. For the first time in 500 years, the Roman Empire is being forced to go cold turkey. And what happened next proves a theory that will change how you see every historical collapse forever. Rome didn't fall because of barbarian invasions, economic problems, or political corruption. It fell because it was a drug empire that couldn't figure out how to function sober. Here's the horrifying truth that historians don't want to admit. Romans had built their entire civilization, military, government, religion, and social structure around the systematic consumption of mind-altering substances. When those substances became scarce due to trade disruptions and territorial losses, Roman society began exhibiting classic withdrawal symptoms on a civilizational scale that had never been seen before or since. The military collapse makes terrifying sense when you realize Roman soldiers had been chemically enhanced for generations without interruption. Picture the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, legendary Roman legions facing Gothic warriors while experiencing their first major combat without pharmaceutical enhancement in centuries. Historical accounts describe Roman soldiers with shaking hands, inability to focus on commands, paranoia about enemy movements, and complete breakdown of the legendary Roman military discipline. These weren't cowards suddenly discovering fear. They were addicts trying to fight, while their brain chemistry was in complete chaos from withdrawal. Modern comparison time. Imagine if every Navy SEAL, Special Forces operator, and Marine had been on performance-enhancing drugs for their entire military career, then suddenly had to fight the most important battle in American history while going through withdrawal. That's what happened to the greatest military force in ancient history. But the governmental breakdown reveals the true scope of this disaster. Roman bureaucrats who had been making complex administrative decisions while under chemical influence for centuries were suddenly forced to govern massive territories while experiencing withdrawal symptoms. The famous Roman governmental efficiency wasn't organizational genius. It was chemically enhanced cognitive function that allowed officials to process information and make decisions at superhuman levels. Without their pharmaceutical enhancement, Roman administrators couldn't handle the basic complexities of running an empire. Tax collection systems collapsed because officials couldn't focus long enough to complete calculations. Legal proceedings became impossible because judges couldn't maintain concentration during trials. Military logistics fell apart because supply officers were too sick from withdrawal to coordinate equipment movements. Imagine a modern corporation where every executive, manager, and department head has been on cognitive enhancement drugs for decades, then suddenly goes sober while trying to run a multinational business during a crisis. But that's what happened to Roman government, and the results were predictably catastrophic. Here's where it gets absolutely devastating. The social fabric of Roman civilization disintegrated because their entire relationship culture had been built on chemical enhancement for generations. Those elaborate Roman dinner parties, marriage ceremonies, religious festivals, and business negotiations had all revolved around shared drug experiences that created artificial social bonds. When Romans couldn't access their usual psychoactive substances, they literally didn't know how to interact with each other anymore. Marriages fell apart because couples had never learned to connect without chemical aids. Business partnerships dissolved because Romans couldn't negotiate deals while sober. Social hierarchies crumbled because the authority relationships had been maintained through controlled drug distribution rather than genuine respect or competence. The rise of Christianity during this period wasn't just spiritual awakening. It was Romans desperately seeking experiences that didn't require pharmaceutical enhancement. Traditional Roman religions had become impossible to practice because they relied heavily on psychoactive substances that were no longer available or affordable. Christianity offered something revolutionary that Roman paganism couldn't provide: spiritual experiences that could be achieved without drugs. The conversion of Constantine wasn't divine revelation. It was a practical political choice by a leader who realized that Roman traditional culture was chemically unsustainable and needed replacement with something that could function during withdrawal. But here's the detail that will haunt you forever. The final collapse wasn't dramatic battles or political upheaval. It was pathetically sad. Picture Romulus Augustulus, the last Roman emperor, a teenager, too young to have developed serious chemical dependencies, watching the adults who should be defending the empire struggle with withdrawal symptoms while barbarian armies approached the city gates. These weren't cowards abandoning their duty, they were sick people whose brains had been chemically altered for so long that they couldn't function under the stress of defending their civilization while sober. The adults who should have been organizing resistance were too physically ill from drug withdrawal to coordinate effective military responses. Archaeological evidence from late Roman sites tells the heartbreaking story of a civilization in pharmaceutical collapse. Desperate attempts to create substitute substances using local plants that didn't work, black market drug operations charging enormous prices for tiny amounts of traditional materials, and evidence of Romans selling family treasures for access to any psychoactive substances that might restore their lost capabilities. Here's the most shocking parallel that should terrify every modern person. Some historians believe certain barbarian tribes conquered Roman territories specifically because they maintained access to psychoactive substances while Romans were in withdrawal. The Goths, Vandals, and other barbarian groups weren't just militarily superior, they were chemically enhanced while fighting enemies who were suffering from civilization-wide withdrawal symptoms. Imagine if China maintained access to cognitive enhancement drugs while America went through nationwide withdrawal, or if Russian soldiers were chemically enhanced while NATO forces were forced to fight sober. The civilization with pharmaceutical access would have overwhelming advantages in every type of conflict. The empire that had conquered the known world while high couldn't survive being sober. Rome's collapse wasn't about politics, economics, or military defeat. It was about what happens when a drug-dependent civilization loses access to the chemicals that made it function. And here's the terrifying question that should keep you awake at night. Look around at modern society's dependence on caffeine, prescription medications, alcohol, and various legal and illegal substances. What happens to our civilization if those supply lines get cut off? Rome's fall wasn't ancient history. It's a preview of what chemical dependency does to entire civilizations. The question isn't whether it could happen again. The question is whether it's already happening. If this blew your mind and made you question everything you thought you knew about history, smash that like button, because apparently we've all been lied to about literally everything. Subscribe for more historical truths they don't want you to know, and drop a comment telling me which Roman emperor's drug habit shocked you the most. Because if Rome's 500-year drug binge can be hidden from history books, what else are they not telling us?